I'm now recording. Okay, so we're going to talk about writing for keyboard. So a lot of this stuff, I'm going to do a screen share so we're all looking at the same part of the workbook. Um, Maybe some of you already had a chance to look over these pages, but I'll go over them with you and just to clarify anything that might require clarification. Um, a lot of this stuff is going to overlap with the guitar stuff. So there's going to be a lot of similar um, elements, especially in terms of less specific parts. That kind of notation is going to be very similar between the guitar and keyboard. The main difference is going to come when you're writing more specific parts, and obviously, as we know, um, if you're writing out more complete types of parts for keyboard, then you're writing for grand staff. You're writing two two staves, treble and bass clef. But anyway, let's do a little overview here. So I'll share my screen so we're all looking at this. Um, oh, that's actually not what I want to share. Hang on. So what I actually want to do is look at the. Oh, I see. I closed this off already. All right, bear with me. Here we go. I just have to get to the right page. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. As I was saying. Okay. So the really the keyboard instrument to end all keyboard instruments is of course the acoustic piano, um, and that's the one that we're most often either writing for or playing a cheap plastic imitation of. Um, so there's some basic things about the piano. So the writing for the piano is non-transposing. So in other words, the notes that you write are the same as the notes that you hear. Um, And you can see that obviously the piano has the biggest range of any instrument in common usage. It's got a gigantic range. It goes all the way from this, you know, A that really just sounds like a rumble at that point, all the way up to this C that only dogs can hear. And you can see these terms here, 8VB and 8VA. Um, so this is telling you that that top C is actually an octave higher than this ridiculous thing here that nobody is ever going to write for. Um, and that low A, the grumbly A, that's actually an octave below this A here. So that's what the 8VB means. Um, so 8VA is an octave higher, 8VB is an octave lower. You end up with piano music, you end up using those terms fairly frequently because a lot of times when you get up into the upper, especially it tends to be more the upper register. When you get up into the upper end of the piano and you want to avoid writing a lot of ledger lines, which is just a pain in the butt, it's better to kind of write it an octave lower and use the 8VA symbol with the use the sort of dotted or dashed line there to kind of indicate the how much of the passage is an octave higher. So that should be familiar to most of you, that idea of writing using the term 8VA. 8VB might be less familiar, but it just means an octave lower. Octave basso. The B is for basso. Um, so yeah, the other thing that you have on a piano is a damper pedal or a sustain pedal. Um, so most of you probably know this, but for those of you who haven't spent a lot of time with pianos, the thing that stops the sound on a piano is these things called dampers, which are basically pieces of felt that hold the strings down. So when you strike a key on the piano, at the same time as the hammer hits the string, the damper comes up, and that allows the note to sound. So then as soon as you let go of the key, the damper is going to fall back down into place, and so the note will stop ringing. So what the damper pedal does is it raises all the dampers um, in a consistent way, um, so that anything you play is going to be sustained. It's not going to die away. So um, when you want to sort of play more legato passages, when you want to kind of um, sort of move in a smooth way from one chord to the next, you'll use the pedal to kind of create that broader type of sustain. The other thing it does, and this is why damper pedal is a more accurate term than sustain pedal, because it does more than just sustains. The other thing that happens when all the dampers are open is that you get the sympathetic vibration of overtones ringing. Um, so if you play a C with the damper pedal down, you're not just going to hear that C. You're going to hear all the notes that are related to that C, including all the other C's and all the G's and everything else, just ringing in this more resonant way. You hear all those pitches anyway, but you're going to hear them more richly. So you get a bigger, richer, thicker sound um, when you have that damper pedal open. Um, Sorry you're having internet problems, Mark. Um, you can always watch this later if as well, since it's going to be up on Moodle, if that continues to be a problem.
Awesome. It's being okay right now, but yeah, it keeps like cutting everything out. So
Okay,
all
yeah.
good.
So if it becomes like a insurmountable problem, then you can just watch this later in the comfort of your own home with a bowl of popcorn or something. All right. Um, so moving along to other keyboard instruments, because obviously in contemporary music we're not only dealing with the piano, we're dealing a lot with electric keyboards as well. Um, so you can tell how old this book is by the fact that the first thing they talk about is the Fender Rhodes. Um, of course, the Fender Rhodes has made a comeback in the last several years, but um, was a very popular instrument during the 1970s in commercial music, and especially in funk and R&B and jazz fusion. And it has this sort of typical bell-like sound. I mean, there's a decent Rhodes sound on this. It kind of sounds like that. There was also a Wurlitzer electric piano that was popular, that was similar. It had a somewhat reedier sound. Um, Basically, the way the sound was produced on those, they're not electronic instruments. They're electronically amplified mechanical instruments. So on a Fender Rhodes, there is actually a hammer hitting something instead of a string like on a piano. It's hitting a metal tine, almost like a tuning fork. So you get that sort of bell-like sound that's then amplified through an amp. Um, and the Wurlitzer was similar, but smaller, kind of thinner tines. Um, the Wurlitzer would be associated with, and I'll play some next week. I'll play a bunch of stuff for you just so you hear what some of these instruments sound like. Um, typical Wurlitzer would be "Bloody Well Right" by Supertramp, if you know that one. That whole long keyboard intro, that's a Wurlitzer piano, and also that. If anybody knows that, Aretha Franklin, "Never Loved a Man." That's Wurlitzer piano there. Um, The Rhodes, I mean, you hear that pretty commonly on a lot of um, soul and funk music and disco and stuff from the 70s. A lot of, like I said, jazz fusion, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock. Those guys were all using the Rhodes a lot in the 70s. Um, so that brings us to synthesizers. So a synthesizer is a little different than the electric piano because the sound is electronically produced. So it's a truly, whereas an electric piano is an electric instrument, not an electronic one. There's a distinction there. Um, Electronic means that the sound is produced electronically. It's basically a sine wave, or some type of wave. Um, and originally synthesizers are called synthesizers because basically they were a synthetic way of trying to recreate certain kinds of sounds. They originally started that way, very much like, you could argue that the original synthesizer was the pipe organ, all the way back to in the, whenever the pipe organs were invented. They were basically trying to replace an orchestra and imitate all the instruments. So you had the stops on an organ that would say, like, say, flute, oboe, clarinet, um, these kinds of things. So synthesizers started out as a way to try to approximate some of those orchestral sounds in an artificial way, but they sort of became um, unique instruments unto themselves, where you have a whole range of sounds that you can get on a synthesizer, especially if you actually get into programming and not just using the factory presets. Um, and really, they just um, my favorite use of synthesizers is when they don't sound like other instruments, when they actually are used to make sounds that are unique to electronic, an electronic instrument. Um, so it talks here about range. Synthesizers are concert instruments with an unlimited range. Uh, so you can control the most keyboards like electric keyboards will have an octave transpose control somewhere. So you can theoretically go up or down um, and have, as it says, have an unlimited range. Uh, there are monophonic and there are polyphonic synthesizers. The original synthesizers, the first ones were all monophonic, like things like the Mini Moog and things like that. The Moog synthesizers means that you could only play one note at a time, so you couldn't really play harmony. You could only play lead lines. Um, so eventually, they came out with polyphonic synthesizers where you could play full chords and orchestral effects and things like that. Um, and most of the modern synthesizers can play basically as many notes as you have fingers, or you can use your nose or whatever. Like you can play as many notes as you actually physically can play. Uh, and you can use pedals with synthesizers as it mentions here. Um, you can control, you can have a volume pedal, so you can bring the volume up and down and control it that way. There are sustain pedals and things like that as well that you can use with synthesizers. Um, and synthesizers generally will have a pitch bend control. Um, and sometimes it's a wheel, sometimes it's a little joystick. Really depends on the make. And usually it'll sort of, in one direction it'll do pitch control, and in the other direction it will do um, you'll get those things like vibrato effects and things like that. So um, this digital piano that I have here does not have a pitch bend wheel on it. Otherwise I could demonstrate some of those effects, but we'll listen to some stuff next week. We'll have another listening session. Uh, Tone control and special effects. Synthesizers are capable of a wide variety of tone controls and special effects. These can range from imitating acoustic instruments to creating innumerable sound effects. Synthesists take pride in their ability to create unique sounds. Therefore, the arranger must supply explicit written instructions on a synthesizer part to communicate the desired sound. The following are examples of typical instructions. They include a description of tone and attack, and, if appropriate, an acoustic instrument reference sound. Um, so, for example, the first example there, bright percussive brass sound. And I would note that a brass sound on a synthesizer does not sound like a brass section, not really, unless it's a really good sample. And that's something that I should also mention is that um, there is a difference between a sampling keyboard and a synthesizer. Nowadays, a lot of you have machines that sort of do a combination of things, and a lot of times um, it's all digitized now. Like a lot of people just, in the old days, the old days in the 70s and 80s, you see these rock bands on stage with like multiple banks of keyboards, and you're just surrounded by a sea of keyboards. Nowadays, you'll have like one keyboard and then a laptop or something like that, because you can control all the sounds from there. So it's often a combination of sampling modules and synthesizer modules. And the difference is that, um, just to be really clear about that, a sampling um, module or a sampling keyboard uses actual recorded sounds of an instrument, um, like a flute sound or trombone or saxophone or whatever, violin. Whereas synthesizers are using electronically produced tones um, to create the sounds. So that's the difference. Just to be clear about that. Um, so here's some other potential things: percussive marimba sound, clavinet sound. Um, so clavinet, just while we're on that, because that's another kind of typically used, if not the actual instrument itself, then um, certainly an electronic or synthesized or sampled version of it. Um, so, how many of you are familiar with the clavinet as a sound? You know that a little bit. Well, you know that. Let me see if I have one here. Um, let's see. I don't know if I'm not sure if I have a clavinet sound on this keyboard. I don't think so. It's a bit like a harpsichord. So the harpsichord obviously is very associated with Baroque music, in the 1600s, right? Bach would have, mostly written for that. Um, so the clavinet was like an electronic. It was an invention of the 1970s that was basically supposed to be like an electric harpsichord. Um, and again, like the Rhodes, it was an actual mechanical instrument where there were um, little plectrums inside plucking the strings, which is what a harpsichord does. Instead of hammers hitting strings, there are little plectrums that actually pluck the strings as you play the keys. So the clavinet has that similar kind of technology, and then it's amplified. And it's something that, and again, next week I'll play some examples. Um, but think of like, what's Stevie Wonder's, yeah, stuff like that. Um, there's also a Led Zeppelin tune that uses that clavinet thing, and some stuff by the band. Um, uh, Cripple Creek by the band, if you're familiar with that. Uh, Garth Hudson plays it through a wah wah pedal on that. On that. Um, so anyway, it's got that kind of real funky kind of attack. So it's great for really percussive parts. So it was very popular in funk music. Herbie Hancock used it a lot on stuff on some of his '70s stuff like Headhunters and all that. So just a side note about the clavinet because that's a sound that that will come up. Okay, so let's look at the actual notation. So the um, first version is exactly the same as what we would write for guitar if we're writing just comping notation, where we just simply write time slashes and chord symbols. That's it. So that's straightforward. And just the same as the guitar as well, we can also write specific rhythms when we want. So again, this is nothing new. This is a repeat of the guitar topic. So all this stuff would be exactly the same. Um, so the main difference is that you want to specify what instrument you're looking for, what kind of sound you're looking for. Um, this is funny. This is like, to me, this is hilarious. DX7 Road Sound chorus effect. I mean, that's like uh, every pop song from the '80s. So that's a sound that's very much dated. Although everything comes around again. It's like this sound, this DX7 Rhodes sound, totally replaced the real Rhodes in the '80s, and it has its own character. It's got that sort of glassy sound that is really typical of all those, like whatever, whether it's Madonna or um, Eurythmics, all those tunes from that era. Um, so that was the sound that kind of replaced the actual Rhodes as the electric piano sound of choice. And it's pretty dated now, but just as the actual Rhodes has made a comeback in recent years, that DX7 sound is starting to make a bit of a comeback. But, I can still remember going to Long and McQuaid Music Store back in the '80s when I was in high school and like going to see the DX7 because it had just come in and it was like the new thing, and like it's kind of hilarious to think about that now because technology has come so far. And it was expensive too back then. It wasn't cheap. Now you could probably get one for like $100. um, just like with the guitar, specific rhythms should be included on the keyboard part when the arranger wants to establish a stylistic rhythmic pattern to indicate a sustained chordal sound while the guitar player provides the rhythmic pattern. That would be another example. Um, or just like with the guitar, to indicate specific rhythms that the whole band plays together. And then here's an example of, for most of us, when we're writing in contemporary styles, whether it's pop or jazz, uh, we're going to be writing this type of thing where we're, using a mix of comping, slashes with chord changes and specific rhythms where they're really relevant to the shape of the piece and the movement of the piece. And again, this is a reiteration from the guitar segment, but note that the chord symbol is placed directly above the rhythm or the slash where the harmonic change occurs. So just, always make sure that your chord symbols are lined up with where they're occurring rhythmically. Um, here's another kind of carryover from guitar notation. You can write the top note of the chord voicing and not write the rest of the voicing. Um, and when you're doing that, you have to sort of indicate it in writing that that's what it is so that the player knows. So you actually, words count for a lot. Top note of voicing. Then they know that, they're not just playing single notes. Oops, let me get rid of that sound. So it would be something like that. Anyway, Um, so then the next thing would be specific voicings. You don't necessarily need grant staff for this, but you know sometimes it's going to be just really like one-handed voicings. Um, so you could just write them in the treble clef, like in this example. Specific voicings should be included when the previous comping notation discussed does not adequately communicate what the desired part should be, or if the voicing demanded by the music cannot be expressed with a conventional chord symbol. So sometimes you have a really specific sound or shape of notes that you want that, you know, just writing a regular chord symbol is not going to necessarily give you what you want. So in that case, you would actually write the notes out for the player and say, these are the notes I want to hear. Um, in this case, chord symbols in parentheses are for reference only. And then the last one is, you know, the most common one, or sorry, not the most common, but it's the most complex one, and also it's the one that, you know, we probably most strongly associate with the piano is this two staff kind of writing, the so-called grand staff, um, where you have the, you know, the treble and bass clef. And I tend to think of the treble and bass clef. I think of the grand staff as one thing. You know, that's something that I tell piano students who are, you know, trying to get better at reading. Um, you know, one of the clues I think is like if you look at the grand staff not as two separate staffs like a treble clef and a bass clef, but if you think of it as a single continuous staff with middle C as the kind of bridge, that middle C that's the ledger line, one ledger line below the treble staff or one ledger line above the bass staff. Um, that's the dividing line, and you go up or down from there. So most of you are not going to need to write this way. You know, I think that the other types of notation are probably going to serve your purposes pretty well for most of what you're doing, but you may have some, you know, some things, especially if you're a piano player yourself, um, where you have a specific kind of piano riff or something or part that you really want to hear that's you want to hear that thing specifically. Then you might write a grand staff part like this. And you can also you can change partway through a part too. You can change from a two staff to a single staff system. Um, and here's an interesting. This is a cool example of um, taking a single staff piano part where you're just kind of laying out the rhythms with the chord symbols and transforming that into a grand staff style part where the voicings are actually written out in a specific way. You know, so, you know, the main difference is that if I look at the first one, then I'm going to just make up my own voicings. And, you know, um, I have a pretty good repertoire of voicings. So, you know, I'm going to play something that sounds good. So, you know, on the other hand, if I look at the bottom one, I'm going to play with what's there. I mean, I probably won't. If it's a jazz situation and I'm looking at that, I might play some of those voicings exactly as they are. But you know, but if you know, if you want, if as a writer, if you want something really specific, you would write it out, and then I would play what's there. So, one, two. It's not that different than what I played. Actually, it's surprisingly close. If the voicings for either hand span an interval of an octave or less, the part will be playable regardless of the size of the keyboardist's hands. So that's a good point. Um, you know, I can reach a tenth in some keys, but not every piano player can. So, some pianists can reach tenths easily. Most of us can at least get a ninth. But just to be on the safe side, if you keep everything with either hand within the span of an octave, just in terms of chords that you have to reach, um, and also don't write any chord voicings with more fingers than a pianist has. Like just FYI, you know, that's when that's when you have to start using your nose, or your foot or something like that. And then you can get into stuff like this where you have like multi keyboards happening. Like this example 10, this rock ballad example. Um, so you have a part in the on the left hand part that would be acoustic piano, and then you're playing this lead line on an organ sound with the right hand. It's probably not going to be a DX7. I just get such a kick out of that. That's a DX7. That's the default synthesizer reference. Um, Here's another example where it's just showing you have basically horn pads with the synth in the right hand, and then you're comping on piano with the left hand. So that's something that, I don't do a lot of this, although I have done some, but, keyboardists that are real, kind of experienced as multiple keyboard players are used to doing this. They're used to playing a different instrument with each hand, you know. So, um, that's something you don't have to be afraid to write like that. And in some cases, if it's for a recording, then those parts might be overdubbed anyway, or played by two separate people. And that brings us to the homework. So I'll just go through these examples. And again, this will be one of these situations where you can, pick one or two examples. Uh, they're all going to be a little bit different, but I'll just go through these and then I'll show you. I'm going to connect my iPad so that I can sort of show you how I would get started with this type of thing. So, so with this one, this is a little bit less specific in terms of the instructions than some of the previous examples. It's super specific on one level, and on another, there's room for uh, you to use your own kind of creative imagination to come up with a part. So, um, so the two parameters for this first example are one, come up with a specific comping rhythm consisting of predominantly short note values. So they want something kind of rhythmic, is what that says to me, like a rhythmic part that's going to be kind of like a groove part. When I think of short note values for a keyboard part, then especially in the style, I'm looking at the style too. It's a funk style, so I'm thinking that's going to be some rhythmic stuff like that Stevie Wonder thing that I was playing, that kind of thing. It's going to be something in that ballpark, and that's going to be just a repetitive figure that continues throughout the piece. Um, and so then the only other parameter is to indicate an appropriate sound reference for the synth player. So that could be clavinet sound or Rhodes sound or um, you know funky brass patch or something like that. Some kind of indication of the general ballpark of sound that you want to hear. So that's the first example. In the second example, they're looking for a synth part. Um, and here they're looking for specific comping rhythm consisting of predominantly long note values. So this to me says pads, so really you're playing like orchestration. So indicate an appropriate sound reference for the synth player. So this would be like, mellow string sound or something like that, or lush pad, something along those lines. That's going to give a sonic reference, and then leave it up to the synth player to come up with the goods. And so basically you're going to have kind of half notes and whole notes, goose eggs as we like to call them in the biz, and maybe some little moving lines here and there, like quarter notes moving into the next chord, but mostly it's going to be longer held notes. And this final example here, there's your grand staff, and they want you to supply an acoustic piano part for the following rock ballad tune. Given these specific instructions, the piano will play both the melody and the counter line in the right hand, and the bass line doubled in octaves in the left hand in a two-staff system consisting of treble and bass clef. So, I mean, in a way, this is kind of easy, and also not, at the same time. The easy part is that really you just have to copy this top line for the treble clef of the piano part, and then you have to come up with a bass line, and then they want the bass, um, uh, they want the bass, um, doubled in octaves. So, that's pretty straightforward. Just what you would write, whatever you would write for a bass player, but then you would just, harmonize it an octave higher or lower. Um, and then it also says they want specific close position triadic voicings that harmonize the melody in the right hand, while the left hand plays the roots of the chords in bars 9 to 16. So those first two instructions are for bars 5 to 8. Starting in bar 9, they're looking for um, close position triad voicings that harmonize the melody in the right hand. Okay, so this is where all your triad inversions and everything that we've been, hammering away at in basic keyboard, this is where this really comes into play. So if I'm looking at this bar 9, um, I'm going to look at this as, I'm going to look at G being the melody note. I'm going to try and voice an E minor 7 down from there. So they want triad parts. So for seventh chords, this is the thing that we haven't really, I mean, you're talking about this in harmony class, I'm sure, seventh chords. We haven't talked a lot about seventh chords, but something that I want you to sort of cultivate an awareness of is, and maybe I'm just going to put my keyboard camera on for a second. Because something that I want you to sort of start cultivating an awareness of is the idea that a seventh chord is really a triad with another bass note underneath it. So if I see something like E minor 7, here's E minor 7, but if I take the E away, I'm left with this G major triad. So we can play that G major triad in all of its inversions, and then if I play that E underneath it, it's an E minor 7, no matter what inversion I'm playing the G triad in. So when I see that E minor 7 on the page, and they say they want a close position triad voicing voiced down from the melody, I'm going to play a first inversion G major triad, because that's going to give me that third on top of the E minor 7 chord. Right? So then, in the next bar, those are just triads, so that should be a no-brainer. I mean, maybe not a no-brainer, but a small brainer anyway. So I see the third on top. As soon as I see the third on top of a triad, I know that that's a second inversion triad. If I see the fifth on top, like on the A chord, that's going to be root position, right? And then I'm back to E minor. And if I'm voicing down from the melody, it's going to be that first inversion G triad again. So now how about C major 7? Um, somebody tell me off the top of their head. So what would the upper structure triad be on a C major 7 chord?
E minor.
Exactly, E minor. So if the root is the top note of an E minor triad, which it is in this case, it's E. What inversion of the triad would that be? Which inversion has the root on top?
First.
Second or first?
First, yeah. So here's root position. There's first inversion. So there's my E. And then I'm going to put that C underneath it. So the B minor 7 is going to be similar idea. It'll be a first inversion D major triad, right? Because that D, there's B minor and B minor 7 in root position. So you can see that D triad. So I need a first inversion of that in order to get that D on top. Everybody see that? So, in terms of really understanding, this homework and in general, how you can write voicings um, for seventh chords in their basic form, because of course, when you get into denser sort of jazz harmony, then you're getting into adding nines and 11s and 13s and things like that. But if you're talking about just basic seventh chords as they occur largely in pop music and, quite a lot in jazz as well, look at it in terms of, the triad on top of the bass note, and then if you isolate that triad, play it in whatever inversion you need in order to sort of support the melody accordingly, or just have a nice sounding voicing. Because the thing is, when you start inverting those triads, every inversion has its own kind of quality, its own sonic sort of beauty. So it's a nice thing to play around with. I would recommend for anybody, whether you're a piano player or not, spend some time just taking those seventh chords and breaking them into two, playing the root in your left hand, and then moving the upper triad through inversions. Just have some fun with that. It'll give you a little bit more of a sense of how piano players deal with harmony. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the share for a second and come back to my regular camera. First of all, before I go on here, any questions so far? I mean, most of this is similar enough to the guitar segment that, it should be relatively self-explanatory. The main difference being we have that grand staff notation in the mix. But as I say, that's probably, most of you are going to probably end up using that minimally. So what I'm going to do here is just switch over to my sharing my iPad screen, which just always takes me a little minute to set up because I have to actually sign into the meeting. And then I'll sort of show you how I would get started with some of this homework. And this, by the way, the keyboard homework will be the last real, homework before the end of the term. We might have a little quiz or something like that, but I want to give everybody, mostly this is just to kind of exercise your writing muscles, and beyond that, I want you to put whatever energy you have left over after your other assignments. Um, I want you to be able to put into your final project, which some of you have already made some headway on, or even come close to finishing. Okay, so there we go. Now you're looking at my beautiful iPad screen. So I'm going to come over here to, and you can see that I've loaded up the assignment. So what I've done here is I started writing an example of something along the lines of what they're asking for here. So I made a short kind of little rhythmic phrase, and I'll, of course, I'll add in the chord changes as well here. Oops. Now my Apple Pencil doesn't work. Let's see. Oh, come on. All right, hold on for 1 second. Let's see if I can get this working. Oh, there we go. All right. Sweet. I just had to repair it. Okay, so then, yeah, you would put your chord symbol in as well. So that's my little figure that I came up with. It's just a little kind of funky 16th note based rhythm. So the rhythm is oh, maybe I have an extra half beat in there. I did this quickly. No. Yeah, this should have been a quarter rest. There we go. Not a very good quarter rest, but anyway. Da, 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 da. Yeah. Da, 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 da. So that's the rhythm, so that's just going to keep repeating. So because I don't want to keep writing that same rhythm out again and again, I'm probably just going to do this. Oh, now my pen does. Now it's not working again. What's up with that? Come on now. Let's see if I can. It's probably just has lost its charge. Try one more time here. There we go. So you just kind of keep you can write these little repeat. That's like a 1-bar repeat symbol. You can use that to indicate that the rhythm is going to keep going. Or the other way you could do it is just write sim, meaning similar, that rhythmic pattern keeps going. So it's going to sound something like, if I was playing it for real. So that kind of idea. And then indicating an appropriate sound. So let's say clav, something along these lines. This is kind of so that's telling me what sound I'm going to use, and then then I've got my rhythm there. So that's basically what that's going to look like. And so for something like this, this is going to be more like probably whole notes like this. G minor 7, you want to write the chord symbols in. Okay, so it doesn't, this pencil doesn't want to write anymore, but that's the kind of idea. And I think that with this example, that's a little bit more complex. If you want to tackle that, I'm not going to, you don't have to tackle this one. I'm going to say, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say do the first one for sure, and don't use the same rhythm that I used. Come up with your own thing. And then you can do either the second one or the third one. And which one you choose depends on just how much you want to challenge yourself. Everybody's got a lot on their plate, so if you don't want to kind of take on this challenge, that's cool. But also, it might be good because to have to write a two-staff piano part, because most of the information is there for you, and whatever isn't there, I basically kind of told you how to, in those last several bars, bar 9 to the end there to 16. I basically gave you the instructions of how to figure out the inversions of the triads. So when you see the seventh chords, the trick is to relate them to figure out what the upper structure triad is on that seventh chord, and then figure out what inversion of that triad you need to put the melody on top. And you don't have to do the specific melody rhythm. As far as I'm concerned, if you just write half notes and whole notes, but just write the whole voicing out. So you'll probably put the roots in the left hand and put the triad in the right hand. Okay, for that bar 9 to 16 section, if you choose to do that one. All right, so at this point, I'm going to stop recording because that's basically the end of the lesson. I'm going to also stop my iPad screen share. Goodbye.